The original Switch hardware was a runaway success for Nintendo, so it's not too surprising that Nintendo would like to continue to follow the same path as the Switch, i.e. a hybrid design with the capability, of course, of playing games in a portable-like mode, but bump up the performance significantly, as well as include a plethora of new technologies. So in this video then, I'd like to talk to you guys about a number of updates I've received concerning the specifications of the Switch 2, or whatever Nintendo ends up calling it, as well as the technologies features within the console and of course the performance targets. There has been a lot of confusion, particularly with DLSS and ray tracing support, so I really want to clear it up for you guys and give you some insight into what probably we can expect from this next generation console. And of course we're going to get into all of this after this message from the video's sponsor.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
So let's start things out with the basics. What hardware are we looking at inside of the Switch 2? From what I understand, despite Nintendo and Nvidia considering several variants of hardware, and it has gone through several iterations, they seem to have opted to stick with T249. Now, if you've been following the channel for a few years, you'll know that I first leaked back in August of 2020, Nintendo were looking at some type of upgraded Switch hardware. It seemed then to be kind of a Switch Pro. About 9 months later, I then confirmed through sources that we would see the inclusion of DLSS, and also started to get some better hints as to what this console would be capable of. Things got a bit quieter, although I did have a couple of updates here or there, and I was basically told that there were some apparent tweaks to the design as well as the console's capabilities. Other leaks though from the internet have seemed to point to Nintendo packing 12GB of memory into the console. This of course is a significant uptick to the original Switch. And this info seems to match what I've been hearing myself. Now, I did put out a video to say that I had heard some alternative specs and Nintendo had apparently been speaking with Nvidia of potentially a different design, but this set of specifications is now what seems to be the most accurate. Of course, it's possible this information is wrong, but I do believe that this is most likely correct, and I'll tell you why more in just a moment, but let's just quickly go over the specs. There are 8 Cortex A78 CPU cores, 12 SMs based upon Nvidia's Ampere architecture. However, it seems to also have some hybrid Lovelace features, although I'm not quite certain what those are. 12GB of LPDDR5 memory at 128-bit width. I've also heard some mixed information regarding clocks. One source told me that the memory clock is 6400 Mbps docked, 4800 however when handheld. Another told me that this is not quite correct and claimed it was 4267, although they didn't specify whether this is docked or undocked. I'm assuming it would be undocked. Storage is 256 to 512GB of eMMC. I'm not certain if it's 2 configurations that the Switch will be sold in, or whether it's just simply the size is undecided. After all, Sony, Microsoft have released consoles with different sizes, at launch, so it wouldn't be too surprising if that's what Nintendo chose to do, a cheaper model, for example. DLSS 3.1 seems very likely, however, one source told me that DLSS 3.5 can be added in, while the other source told me that this is not true. So what of ray tracing? Well, ray tracing technically can run in hardware, I was told by a couple of sources, but generally speaking, games probably won't leverage it due to the performance impact. Ray tracing is a very wide topic and can be used for a plethora of things, not just graphics, but even things, for example, like audio. It's very possible that there could be light touches of RTN graphics, for example shadows, but again the capability is there. But of course, as always with these things, it's going to be down to the developer on how or if it's used. I'm also told that the performance targets do seem to be within about 10 to 20% of the Xbox Series S, probably dependent upon the application, resolution and many other factors, but this is when docked. I also believe this is probably when DLSS is enabled, and let's be honest, it probably will be used quite frequently. Undocked, I was told that the performance is probably closer to higher-end PC handhelds, such as what we've seen from, let's say, Asus. Now, I want to really talk about the Unreal Engine 5 as well as Final Fantasy claim. We'll start with the Matrix demo first, because it certainly sounds the most impressive and perhaps arguably as well one of the more realistic claims. So yes, there were reports that the Switch 2, or whatever the hell it ends up being called, were running this demo. I've spoken to a few people and one person told me that this is true, and going over specifications with some other people, I think it's quite realistic that it could run the software. The targets, however, will likely differ based upon, well, of course, this hardware compared to, let's say, an Xbox Series X version of the demo. Lower internal resolution, using DLSS to upsample, possibly change to the LODs and other tweaks. Unfortunately, when we talk about any console and its performance, it's very difficult to talk about the hardware in isolation. For example, you can't just say, well, the console has X amount of RAM, this GPU, this CPU. There are a lot of things which go into performance, tweaks to caches, memory adjustments, the actual efficiency of the architecture, the SDK, drivers, software, and just the familiarity as well, of course, of the developers with the hardware can have huge ramifications as to what we can get out of it. This is just pretty typical, so unfortunately we just do not have the full story. I wouldn't, however, be super surprised if Lumen, for example, could run on UE5 games with, again, some concessions and of course certainly lower resolution and potentially some upsampling with DLSS. Also, of course, some visual settings simply may not be enabled if the game is running in undocked. I've also heard some reports, as I'm sure many of you have, that the Switch 2 was capable of running FF7 Remake as well as the PS5. Spoken to several sources about this and I cannot verify it and I cannot vouch for it. I haven't seen it running. None of the people I've spoken to can say that they've heard about it, or at least they're not willing to talk about it. But I will say, and again I could be totally off base here because I have not seen this demo, it's possible that the demo could have been running in handheld mode. So if you're comparing it against the PS5, it makes it a lot harder because you can't do things like pixel count really, just visually. And also it would be much more tricky to figure out visual cuts, shadows, lighting, if there's frame rate hiccups, whether there's, well, what if frame rate is it even running in? I'm personally very skeptical to believe it runs as well as the PS5. I mean, the PS5 and Series X are leagues ahead of this machine in theory, but with optimization, DLSS, tweaks to the software, it's very possible that at a glance, it could look pretty decent and possibly close to the PS5. Again, you probably wouldn't exactly have a PS5 version to compare it against. And also, it said as well as the PS5 in terms of how it ran, not necessarily how it looks visually, which of course is a very different statement. Without knowing the details of the demo, it's just very difficult to really be certain. What I am told, however, is that the hardware has been at least considered to be backwards compatible with the current Switch, but I cannot be certain whether this is actually going to make the cut and into retail hardware. Now, whether as well, if this is true, we would see any performance enhancements, for example, would the game run with a more stable frame rate, for example Zelda, or perhaps with a higher resolution. And games of course do typically have dynamic resolution, so would it stick to a higher dynamic resolution, or would it just simply mirror and ape the original Switch hardware? I honestly don't know. It's also possible that Nintendo could simply release patches or enhanced versions of games. Sony have done that, Microsoft have done that, so I simply don't know. Another source has also told me that the camera rumour regarding this hardware is true, but unfortunately, just like some other things here, I simply can't be sure exactly how it works. An example I was given would be something like Pokemon Go, but it may not be 100% true, and of course, theoretically that would only be in handheld mode. There's a lot of things that theoretically it could do in docked mode, but that would be speculative on my end at best, so I don't want to start adding a ton of speculation into the video. Even though it makes some logical sense, I don't really want to start watering this video down with tons of speculation, because I just don't think that that would be a good fit. But with any console release, there are so many rumours and hype, it's very difficult to know exactly what is true. And well, when we're seeing demos or talking about demos, there simply may be systems that are not running that normally would in a full game. For example, AI might not be happening. So it's difficult to know exactly what is representative versus what would actually be the case if the game was really running on actual hardware. With that said, the upgraded hardware is coming, and I think it will be a tangible, noticeable upgrade versus what we have with current hardware. I think it will be a much better fit for modern 4K displays. Although of course it also means that it's going to heavily rely on DLSS. And DLSS is not magical. At the end of the day, it can only do a finite amount of stuff based upon what input that it has. Now, it's possible that Nintendo have some slightly tweaked version of DLSS, and some games, I imagine, with their art style from Nintendo, could look really nice with DLSS, for example, Mario. But with that said, it's possible that we could see 1080p to 4K with DLSS, or I think it's possibly even more likely that 720p could be, used internally and then rendered up to a higher resolution for the output. And of course, in handheld mode, there's even questions of, would the tensor cores go dark in handheld mode? Would they save energy? Would they be running, however, at 480p so that the GPU could be a lower in clock frequency? Without knowing full details of the actual hardware and specifications, it's very difficult to know this stuff, and again, it brings us into speculative territory. I also cannot get confirmation on frame generation. DLSS 3 support does indicate that it's true, but yeah, I mean, would it run? I honestly do not know. Theoretically, frame generation works better at, say, 60 FPS, but what about 30 FPS? How about precision platformers? Again, these are questions that I simply cannot be certain of, and it will be very interesting to see how it affects things in terms of latency. At this point, if I was to simply guess, and I stress this is a guess, frame generation probably is supported with the hardware, but again, I cannot be certain. I've had some sources tell me that it basically is, whereas others are being somewhat more, let's just say, hesitant. But anyway, much of this is speculative, and while there are some likely answers than others, a likely answer is not necessarily confirmation. So there you have it, guys. I think we have a better understanding now of what we can expect for this next generation hardware, assuming this information is accurate. But at this point, I've heard this info from several sources, so it does seem a most likely scenario for the next generation Switch. Now, yeah, sure, this is not going to outperform the PlayStation 5 and certainly not even going to be close to, let's say, the PS5 Pro, but it's also Nintendo that we're talking about here. Sure, for a while they were chasing the performance crown, for example with the N64, but more recently, for example with the Wii, they simply haven't taken that approach. And at this point, I think Nintendo have managed to create a niche for themselves of a design which is portable, but also very flexible and offers enough performance to plug into your home television. So the Switch Pro, the Switch 2, whatever it ends up being called, is going to be very interesting. I will also be super curious to see how the console market evolves over the next couple of years. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the PlayStation 5 Pro, and I've leaked a lot of the specifications for that as well. I will be very interested, however, to see exactly what happens with the Switch 2, because it's not just going to impact, of course, well, Nintendo, but with DLSS support, it's going to be very interesting for games going forward. Obviously, it's not likely that we'll see, let's say, Mario being ported to the PC, but in terms of the support of DLSS, it's going to mean that a lot of developers, in theory, who want to craft Switch versions of games, well, they're going to have even more capabilities and a lot more experience with DLSS. Theoretically as well, it might mean that Nintendo could contribute and possibly offer some ideas for DLSS going forward. Either way, there's a lot of stuff that honestly we can speculate all day over, but it's going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the console is capable of, and of course to see what games are actually going to look like. With that said, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day, bye for now.